If I had to ask you to picture the Veg Map project, I bet that many of you have this picture in mind. And that's not surprising because the National Vegetation Map tends to be the flagship product of the Veg Map project. It gets used in a whole bunch of very useful ways. But one of the things that we have to remember is that the Veg Map project has several components in addition to the National Vegetation Map. And so in the early 2000s, when the Veg Map project was being developed, and Sanby, with a whole bunch of collaborators from across the country, wanted to develop this map and classification system that would capture all the diversity across all the different biomes in the landscape. And one of the things that they wanted to do was to collect all of the plot data that existed at the time and try and make a bottom-up approach to classification. But what happened is they found that there was not enough plot data that was systematically distributed across the country in order to develop a wall-to-wall vegetation map. So they then used a mix of existing data and expert opinion in addition to some of that plot data to develop the National Vegetation Map, which was really useful and worked out quite well. But what happens to all of that plot data? They turned that plot data into something that we call the National Vegetation Database, or the NVD. And that's something that still exists today. It's not necessarily made available online just like the National Vegetation Map. But that's what I want to talk to you about today, is where the NVD currently sits, where we are in terms of sharing the data, what's actually in the National Vegetation Database, and where we would like to be. And then lastly, how the National Vegetation Data exists in terms of the bigger picture of plot data collection in South Africa at the moment. So when I say plot data, this is what I mean. That those plots that are set up within a specified area, and then a team counts all the taxa that occur within that plot and the abundance within that plot. And there can sometimes be a bias towards certain species in the NVD, but this doesn't occur that often. Most times it is a record of all the taxa within the plot. But let's delve a little bit deeper into the NVD and see what's in there. So this is a distribution of all of the current data that's in the NVD. The yellow dots, as you can see, don't cover all of the country, and so we have these big gaps that still remain. And you can see from there that's one of the reasons it couldn't be used to develop a wall-to-wall vegetation map and classification system. What we get is this distribution where you have a few vegetation types with many plots in them, and then many vegetation types that either have no plot data or a little bit of plot data. So it gives us an idea where we have plots already and where we might need to prioritize the collection of plots across the country. Just keeping in mind that even though there might be several plots within a vegetation type, they might not be evenly distributed across the type. So if we had to then look at what's in the database in terms of numbers, we have over 58,000 plots. The plots were generally collected between about the 1950s until 2004, and that's when the switch turns to focusing on mapping using other data. And then in terms of the species bias, as I said, there's many more plots that have no bias. Most of the plots occur within South Africa, but there's a few in Lesotho and Namibia. And then in terms of the location accuracy, we have to remember that because some of these plots were collected at a different time when there either were no GPSs or GPSs were not that accurate, we have to then take into account that not all of the plots are as accurate as we collect data today. So the accuracy varies, and that can be filtered out through the database. And then in terms of the cover scales, there's various cover scales that were used by different researchers. So just to keep in mind that many of the NVD plot data comes from over 150 different projects that the team at the time curated. So what we did do is the team who captured the NVD data then has a column where they've standardized all of the cover scales so that it's to a percentage cover. So that's really useful if you want to extract plots from different projects from the database. If we then look at this map, which is a map of the current extent of remaining natural vegetation in South Africa, what we find is there's the blue bits, which are the areas where there's natural vegetation. And then if we zoom into the darker bits, and so this layer, which was created during the 2018 National Biodiversity Assessment, reflects areas that have been transformed from one land use to another. And so those gap areas then indicate areas that are no longer in their natural state. If we then use this map and overlay the vegetation database plots, we get this picture for the plots that then intersect with areas that are still natural. So these plots can be really useful because they are a snapshot in time in those particular natural areas. But what we also find in those areas where the vegetation has been lost is we also have plots from those regions. And some of these plots might be collections from before degradation or transformation occurred. And that can be really useful for a whole bunch of studies, possibly even restoration work, or to try and get a snapshot of what a degraded form of that vegetation type looks like. And the long-term goal then is to share this data online through a public portal. So Brahms Online is probably going to be the space that we share this, but the platform is not yet ready for the national vegetation plot data. But in the meantime, one of the other things we need to do is sign data sharing agreements with all of the data partners that contributed to the NVD. So that's over 150 different people or universities that we then need to go through this process with. And the reason for this is that back in the early 2000s, there was no formal record of what the agreement was when data was shared. So some of this information could have been shared with the team confidentially, or it could be that it was shared just for the purposes of the National Vegetation Database. So it would be wrong of us to then put that information online without getting some sort of consent from data partners. And so this may take a little bit of time. So if you request data, please be a little bit patient with us. And also, if you know that you have NVD data currently in the database, then please expect that we may approach you in the coming months. So I hope that that gives you an idea of the National Vegetation Database. But I also now want to then delve into how the National Vegetation Database fits within the bigger picture of plot data in South Africa. So back in 2018, we became curious about what other plot data has been collected after 2014 that we have not yet captured in the National Vegetation Database. And we actually found quite a few. So there were about 50 different projects that had plot data that we now need to include in the National Vegetation Database. We'd searched for these projects using keywords both in English and Afrikaans. So it was very interesting. And then we decided, well, we have this information. We wondered what the pattern was in plot data collection over time in South Africa. So when we plotted that out, what we found is that the number of studies that collected plot data over time went through this increase up until the 1980s and 1990s, where there was this huge boom of plot data collection. And then there's a sharp decline in more recent decades. And that's very interesting because plot data is the foundational information for ecological work. There's been a trend towards studies using models and classification as the technology has improved, but there's still no substitute for on-the-ground data collection. The images are still sometimes quite poor at detecting forbs within grasses or the differences between forests and mesic thicket. So we still need to collect these studies. The other thing that we found when we then divided the data across the different biomes is that we have quite a few plots from the grasslands and savannas and not that much from some of the other biomes. And much of this comes from George Bierenkamp and his students' work in the grasslands and savannas. Many of you might have gone straight to the thicket biome, and that might not be all of the studies that's within the biome. So that's something to note, is we might have missed quite a few, but the pattern is still there. If you know of studies that are in the Albany thicket that have plot data, and you are willing to share that so that it can be part of the National Vegetation Database, please contact us so that we can sign the necessary agreements and then include that in the National Vegetation Database for when it finally goes online. And so there's a real need for us to get momentum around plot data collection, especially in those parts of the country where we don't have any information. It's really important to collect the data, and we'd love for you to contact us if you have information that you think might not be in the National Vegetation Database. On the other hand, if you would like to request data from the National Vegetation Database, that will also be incredibly useful to us because it will then help us prioritize which data sharing agreements to focus on first. So if you have a study in a particular area and you send that to us and you send a request, we can then look for whether there are any plots from the NVD in that area, and we can search for who we need to sign agreements for, and we can start with those agreements. The take-home message then is that the National Vegetation Database is incredibly useful as a foundational data set, but we need your help to help us unlock this data so that we can share it, and also to fill in those gaps in plot data across the country. So that's what I have to say in terms of the NVD, but as I mentioned, the Veg Map project has a whole bunch of resources that are associated with the project. And often I get questions about where we can find this information and where you can send information and who you go to ask questions. And so I thought I'd just take one slide to quickly point you in the right direction. Stop shop for most of our data is our web page on VGIS. And if you go there, what you will find is all of the different versions of the spatial layers. So all of the veg maps from 2006 to 2018. You will also find the descriptions of the vegetation types. There's also guidelines for submitting changes to the vegetation map. And quite useful is a digital version of the full 2006 Veg Map book, which you can download for free. The other resource that we have is our citizen science project on iNaturalist. So it's called Veg Map Photo, and the idea with this project is to try and collect a catalog of photographic evidence of communities across all the different types. So in the Veg Map book, there's one photo for the entire type, but there's lots of different communities and examples of those types. So we're trying to collect that information, and we would love your contributions. There's also an indication of whether your photograph represents a degraded version or a natural version of the type, and that can be really useful for ground truthing or field verification, especially when somebody can't get to that particular area, and it's also useful as a training tool. The other thing that's quite useful as a user is a carry map app version of the Veg Map, which then sits on your phone. It's not yet on Beegis, but you can download it from my Google Drive in the meantime. And what you get is a mobile version of the Veg Map. It works best on Android, but if you download Carry Map from your Play Store and you load this file on there, what you can do is you can track which vegetation type you're passing through live with a live locator, and it just uses satellites, so you don't necessarily need cell phone signal. The other thing that's been developed quite recently is I found a way to get the Veg Map onto Google Earth, which wasn't as easy as I thought it would be. Nevertheless, that's also on my Google Drive, but it will be on Beegis hopefully quite soon. But it's just an easy way to get to the Veg Map if you don't have special GIS software. As I said, for the NVD, if you need to send a request to get data out of the NVD, or if you want to share information with us, then please contact us at vegmap@sanvi.org, or contact me directly at a.dayaram@sanvi.org.za. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to hear from you soon.